Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's In Search of Truth program hosted by the Wende Museum. My name is Natalie McDonald, and I'm so pleased, along with my colleagues on the In Search of Truth Student Council, to welcome Professor Soraya de Chadarevian as our special guest for this afternoon's discussion of truth and science. Professor de Chadarevian is a historian of science, technology, and medicine at UCLA, where she teaches courses at the Institute for Society and Genetics and in the Department of History. Her main area of interest is the life sciences in the 20th and 21st centuries. She's published extensively on the history of molecular biology and the complex scientific, institutional, political, and cultural processes that contributed to the development of this new science, with its broad implications for our understanding of the production and reproduction of life. More recently, Professor de Chadarevian has published on the use of genetic evidence in history, on questions of the archives, on genetic studies of human populations, on histories of data and the database. Her most recent monograph, Heredity Under the Microscope, Chromosomes and the Study of the Human Genome, published by the University of Chicago in 2020, is a study of the post-war history of human heredity told from the vantage point of chromosomes. Professor de Chadarevian's research has been supported by numerous grants, including most recently by a Scholar Award from the National Science Foundation. She has held fellowships and visiting appointments at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, among others. Before joining the faculty at UCLA, she was a senior research associate and affiliated lecturer in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge, where she keeps the status of an affiliated scholar. Today's program will feature a 45-minute discussion with Professor Chadarevian, moderated by the Wende's chief curator, Yu Seagal, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A moderated by student council member Gianna Machera. Viewers, we invite you to type your questions into the Q&A found at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any point during the program. We do just ask that you please keep questions as clear and concise as possible. Professor de Chadarevian, it is a true pleasure and privilege to have you with us this afternoon. On behalf of the In Search of Truth Student Council, thank you so much for joining us. We also extend our thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende Museum. Now I'd like to invite Yus to begin our conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. And Soraya, welcome to In Search of Truth. It's wonderful to have you here. Not our current, but our last exhibition at the Wende Museum was called Questionable History. And it really asked the question, what can we know about artwork? What can we know about the history? And Soraya actually visited that exhibition and we had an interesting discussion about it. Because Soraya, you mentioned that although it might be very useful to ask critical questions about what we can know and how we know that we don't know or do know something, it also might suggest that all knowledge is subjective, and especially in times like these where people speak about fake news and alternative facts, that is a danger in a certain way. So I thought that was a very interesting perspective on that exhibition, and I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I'm sure that in today's discussion, some of these points will return, and maybe with a vengeance. So I would like to invite Emma, our first speaker, to ask her question, which is very much about the different disciplines within academia and how they approach the concept of truth.
Yes, hello and welcome. This is a broad question just to get the ball rolling, but academic spaces, society at large often delineates between hard sciences like biology, math, physics, and softer disciplines like sociology, anthropology, and philosophy and history. As you're someone who really toes the line between those two, frameworks of thought, I'm curious to know whether you think there truly is a difference between the hard and soft sciences. And if there is a difference, what is that?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Emma. But first of all, also thank you for inviting me here to the whole council and to youth. And I'm looking forward to discuss with you these very interesting questions, right, about science and truth. So I think this is a good question, Emma, to start with, because it gets us to this basic sort of organization about or understanding about the different sciences and so on, right? So I think you ask about the relationship between the natural sciences, the hard sciences, and maybe the social sciences or humanities, that's supposedly more soft. So my view on this distinction really is that these are historical distinctions, but they're not very sharp and often cut through single disciplines, right? So for instance, if you think of the field of anthropology, that's subdivided into biological anthropology, supposedly the harder science, more sciencey kind of part, and cultural or social anthropology, which belongs more to the other side. And we find similar distinction in sociology, quantitative and qualitative, or in psychology. For instance, at UCLA, which is where I work, psychology has recently moved from being part of the social sciences to move to the life sciences, right? Which really shows, I think, how fluid and dynamic these distinctions are, right? Now, having said this, there have always been sort of attempts to define the differences between the humanities and the natural sciences, right? So, for instance, a Finnish philosopher, Henrik van Richt, has suggested that the natural sciences are about explaining and the social sciences are about understanding, right? But as I said, I think it's actually difficult to really sustain these divisions. And what I definitely think is not correct is to think that the natural sciences are about facts and the humanities are about some soft way of understanding. And that's why the natural sciences should count more or have more power, or, being up in the hierarchy up there. I think many real life problems need input from both, from what you call the soft and the hard sciences. And I would suggest that they're both, the input of these different kinds of sciences is equally important.
Can I ask you, Soraya, do you think there is a difference in the concept of truth as defined by the hard sciences and the soft sciences?
Truth is a big word, right? But what about facts? I think both the natural sciences and the humanities, would look always for evidence of what they say, right? This distinguish them also then from opinions or beliefs or something, right? So you always want to find evidence. And also, this is the hallmark of academic work, that's what we are talking about, that you want to people should be able to check on your references, right, or your evidence. And so in that respect, I think the soft and hard sciences, I like to use the quotation marks, are similar in that respect, right? Yeah, I would not like to make sort of a fundamental difference in the kinds of truths that they produce.
Right, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, even if you believe in the concept of hard facts, or take those facts maybe for granted, there are always people who don't actually accept them. And Meghana, you have a question about that. Yeah.
Yeah, just to expand on it, like while science is generally viewed as an objective discipline, like we kind of discussed, there have been many people in society who choose to dispute scientific facts. For instance, with something like the COVID-19 pandemic, there were and there are people who decide not to accept recommendations and opinions from doctors. Do you believe that there can be different truths in science? And how do you approach people who decide that their personal truth takes authority over scientific facts?
Yeah, so thank you. I think that follows up very well. I think we need to distinguish between facts, opinions, and what you said, I think personal truth, right? So, personal truth, I think per definition cannot be scientific, as science is not personal, right? Science is a communal effort. And so you cannot really have a personal science, right? So this is a contradiction. So you can have your personal beliefs, but that's really something else. And so nobody can be forced to accept, I think, scientific facts. But especially in the context of the pandemic, it seems very useful to follow scientific advice, right? For instance, in regard to the advisability of wearing masks, rather than personal beliefs, right? So personal beliefs can still be important in respect to other questions, right? So I think it depends what kinds of questions we have, right? So, but in the context of a pandemic, I would suggest it's good to listen to the epidemiologist. Oh, even if the epidemiologists don't have the final question, the final answers. I mean, in the end, there are also political and moral decisions. So, yeah, complicated. Maybe we come to that.
Yeah, I think we can actually immediately come to that with the next question by Ashla, which is very much about the acceptance of scientific opinions and also how they might change or how actually different scientists might disagree on certain aspects.
Yeah, I mean, knowing that understanding sources that inform the history of science is a really important component of our collective understanding of what is determined as scientific fact. Like in your research of science history, what have you learned about the ways in which we validate information? Do we accept information as permanent or mutable as we continue to expand our research? And what does this acceptance or reluctance to accept changing views of facts say about us as a people? And can this be a detriment to societal progress? It's kind of a mouthful, but.
Yeah, so let's see. So I do think science changes, right? So I think this is also the hallmark of science. And it's something that shows up clearly also when you study the history, right? So I think if we believe the science or scientific facts are immutable, then I think we are on the wrong track somehow. I think even, Karl Popper, one of the big philosophers of science, has suggested, that science is all about falsification. That really is what characterizes science, is that scientific statements can be falsified. So, and they have to be able to be falsified, right? So that's the game of science, and that distinguishes science, right? So, so scientists always ask new questions, they develop new approaches, new instruments that provide new evidence, and so on. So sometimes these changes are small and more incremental, but sometimes, or just cumulative in nature, but sometimes the changes are more sort of radical, fundamental, and require a more radical revision of accepted knowledge. Now, what's also true, we should not forget, is that nature itself also, or the phenomena we study themselves also change, right? So again, I think the pandemic is a wonderful example for many of these things, because we see science in the making somehow in front of our eyes, right? And we have all lived through it. So, so the virus, for instance, evolves or has evolved and is evolving in response to our actions, but also, actions meaning, if we travel or don't travel, if we isolate, don't isolate, if we vaccinate, don't vaccinate, and all these kinds of things. So the way the virus responds to that, right? And then also we have to change, science evolves and changes with it, right? Because we learn more, and especially this virus is constantly muting and teaching us, right? That even what we observe and what we want to describe is not fixed, right? Does this answer your question? Yeah.
To follow up a bit on the concept of science being about falsification, I remember learning in my science classes in high school that you can never be 100% true or 100% certain in science. But if we use science and the natural sciences, especially to kind of better understand our world, then does that mean that we'll never have a true understanding of our world? Kind of how do those two work together? It's a thinker on that one.
Yeah. So first, the one thing we just was just saying that the world also changes, right? So, but then also and that gets us to the main point of this conversation, right? Of what science and truth. So, a true representation. It sounds like that there is a truth out there, right? That we somehow have to reach, but and that we come maybe closer and closer to that truth, right? But history is somehow not like that, just things changes and there are different perspectives on things and we have different concerns, different needs, different challenges. So we look out for different things, we study things in particular ways. And so, I think there are many truths in that respect, if you want. That doesn't mean that the truth is, it's always the truth in respect to the questions we ask, in respect to the tools we have, but they change. I think this is important to keep in mind because if we don't accept the science change, we get into this, what people have called the flip-flop reaction towards science, right? Either we believe it provides this 100% truth, and then when it changes, we say, oh, the scientists don't agree. We don't need to listen to the scientists because they themselves can't agree and they keep, correcting themselves or whatever, right? And so I think it's really important to understand how science works so that we understand what we can expect from science and also what the limitations of science are.
So you
sorry, go ahead.
So you touched on the idea of sort of the public's perception and understanding of science. So that connects here to the question I would like to ask, because we often see scientific and statistical references in news media and political rhetoric used to dramatically promote specific ideas to the public. As consumers, we aren't necessarily quick to doubt a reference to a study or research paper. We expect the news to do this kind of translation that interprets and instructs us on how to apply this new information to our lives. However, newscasters and politicians often have biases or agendas. Your postdoctoral fellowship in Berlin that identified and studied the practice of scientific work as an entire culture in itself illuminates a culture gap here. So how does your role today function to connect and establish trust between the divergent cultures of the scientific community and the general public?
Good. That's also not an easy question, right? But I mean, generally, I would like to say that it's always important, right, to how the media report science and so on. It's always important to check the sources of information we get. I mean, this is always true, right? And so ideally, we always like to go back to the original source and then also assess that source, right? And although it's, but of course, this is not always practical. So especially when you follow a conversation, you can't always just be there. I mean, the fact checker is something which I quite like, but it's difficult, right? You can't always go back and do all the work you need to do. But still, this idea of being critical towards the sources and the evidence is certainly a principle that guides both historical as well as scientific work, right? So I think this is similar, and also everyday getting information and always thinking, where does this information come from? Who speaks here? For whom? What is the message, right? So this critical work, I think, it's work, but I think it's something that we need to do. Of course, we can't do this all the time, and, we trust certain sources, and that's also important because we can't always start from scratch, and, but this critical work we always have to do. Now, having said that, I mean, I myself am not really involved in science communication. So I do speak to the scientists and I do speak to historians, and I do need the trust of scientists when I interview them for my research projects. and then in my work, I also provide the evidence, for everything I say. And I think I mentioned this already. And so this is how the sciences and the humanities work, right? That we have this evidence and, that can be checked. Now, if I then also want to add my interpretations, right? Then I mark them clearly as my interpretation, right? And it's clear that I speak from a particular standpoint and that I've done some research, and it's all open, right? So that's, I think, so my questions are open, my evidence is open, and also, what I cite from other people and what I think, right? Maybe drawing on all this. And so it's open and everyone can check and continue the conversation. So it's, it's never an end point. It's always just a new point to continue the conversation or the study or questioning, looking from another angle, adding something, complaining, saying, but you missed that, but you misrepresented this, that's part of how this continues.
But Soraya, how would you define being critical towards facts? And I'm asking that because you could argue that adherents of conspiracy theories are very critical. They criticize everything.
Yeah, and being critical, that's all fine, right? But you need to have then counter evidence, which I can check and so on, and that needs to make sense and so on, right? So you can't just criticize, that would be cheap, right? You have to bring new evidence, right? Yeah, but sometimes we don't know, right? Sometimes it takes some time before things come together.
Absolutely, yeah. So sometimes, even if scientists and academics are very focused on fact finding, there might be consequences to their research. And Gianna, I think your question goes in that direction, right?
Yes, it does. In your most recent book, Heredity Under the Microscope, you kind of talk about the consequences and what's going on with science. And I'd really love to ask, why did you choose to focus on this field in particular? And what are some of the blessings and consequences that you think come with this field?
And that's so, yeah, so let's see, thank you for this question. So the book is about the human genetics in the post-World War II period, right? So I have long been interested in the history of the modern life sciences, including genetics, but I had never written about human genetics, right? Which is a complicated field, especially coming out of the eugenic movements and the whole racial theories of the 1930s and 40s. So it's a very fraught field, and especially also in this post-World War II era. But what sparked really my interest in the subject was that the particular area on which I've focused, which was human chromosome research, was clearly a subject that was very important in its time, but that had been sort of written out of the dominant accounts of the history of post-war biology, and so. And that was what intrigued me. And so here maybe we come back to the question of truth, right? Or of truthful account of history. So I was intrigued by the question, why was it written out? And what changes when we, about our understanding about the history of post-war genetics when we write it back in, right? So it was maybe finding truth in history. But also, history, we tell certain stories about the past. And so again, here there is this retelling, asking new questions and asking, so why has this fallen out, right? And yeah, that was, there were also other reasons why I was interested in the topic, but I think that may be going a bit to the question of truth.
Right. Natalie, you have a more or less follow-up question, which also focuses on the same book with a point about people either accepting or resisting certain ideas from science.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. So I think, yeah, coming back a little bit to the conversation about expertise versus skepticism. As a student of history, I've of course been trained to kind of look at the vectors of power and resistance in any given situation. And so that made me wonder if you would give a couple examples from your recent book, Heredity Under the Microscope, of genetic explanations perhaps being resisted. And I'm wondering if that resistance, or at least skepticism on the part of civil society, is an important part of scientific knowledge production, especially given the immense power scientific experts wield by defining some kind of truth. And when and how does resistance go too far, becoming contrarian and potentially dangerous, as we've seen during the pandemic, of course, with in all sorts of instances.
Yeah, so thank you for this question. I do think public critique or resistance can be productive for science if it's based on evidence, or at least on good questions or good arguments, good questions, right? That encourages you to look further. But now in the examples I cite in the book, actually, it's often the scientists themselves that is another group of scientists to the one that did the research, right? Who resisted or protested, or thought that this was not they had something to complain about. And so one example, for instance, is there was a group of science activists. It was called Science for the People, that was very active in the 1970s, in that period here, that protested the assumptions that a particular karyotype, right, this is the XYY. Anyway, there was something in the genes that predisposed children to aggressive behavior, right? And so they critiqued the study design. They thought there were flaws in the study design, right? But also they thought that the whole research question was just misplaced. That is to assume that antisocial behavior had something to do with genetics rather than with socioeconomic conditions. And so they really thought this was wrong and way, just completely wrong way to ask or solve certain problems. So that was one example. Another one, scientists protested the use of a chromosome test to establish the gender of female athletes. And they protested because they believed, so this was the Olympic committees, for instance, introducing this sex test only for female athletes, because apparently there was, male athletes that pretended to be female to have an advantage. So, which happens very, very, very rarely. There were very few examples of this in history, but they introduced this test. And so the scientists protested because they said this was a misuse of their science, because they believed that sex was not an easy binary affair, and that gender identity was a more complex affair than just something written in the genes. And so these were valid critiques that actually with time became also more accepted. But beyond the subject matter of the book, there are also examples, many examples, or at least several examples, let's say. I think it's difficult, but there are examples of local community that successful challenge official accounts. I think especially in the environmental issues, right? And there are examples of people who have, collected evidence. Officials say everything is fine. They do some tests, everything is fine, but they collect evidence and case studies and so on, and possibly also work together with some critical scientists, and actually can really challenge official news, right? So there are definitely some successful examples of that.
Right. So we have another follow-up question on this point about genetics and the concept of a true self. And Hannah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so as we have genetic testing and genetic modification, and those are becoming both more advanced and accurate, we begin to see questions about ethics and questions about the self arise. So how do you feel that genetics play into our own sense of the true self and our own sense of identity?
Yeah, so I think this is actually an important question, right? The extent to which genetics plays to identity, again, depends, right, on what you do with the genetic evidence you receive, right? So some people accept it, you know, when they do the ancestry tests or something like that, right? Some people accept it, and some people reject it, right? So the importance we give to this genetic information, or how much we take them on board, or maybe even form our community around it, right? There, for instance, you know, people with a particular marker in their genes, they form communities around it, right? So this really, this would be a social identity kind of move, right? So this really depends to the importance that you give it to, that the individual gives to this genetic information. So I think it's still in the hand of, you know, identity is really something that we do, right? And so and it depends. Some people take it on, it becomes defining, and other people reject it.
Right.
And because it contradicts, you know, or maybe they accept it, but they say, I don't change my identity. I mean, let's assume you find out that, you know, your parents are actually not your parents, right? But you say, okay, this may be true, but I grew up with these parents, I love these parents, so I accept these parents, right? And I may have biologically different relatives, but, you know, but for other people, this is, they have been looking for that, right? And so then having the proof that, you know, they don't belong in this family, but maybe in another family. So really makes, they go with that, right? So you have some, yeah, it depends on what meaning you give to the genetic information you get.
Right, thank you.
But of course, sometimes also there are more laws and you know, sometimes it's not in your hand actually, and there are, you know, there are some criteria that are set up for you, and which are based on some genetic testing, if you belong or don't belong. I mean, some of these conversations, you know, if you belong or don't belong to a community, and if the genetic test should actually be the decisive test, is discussed. You know, in some communities, for instance, also among Native Americans, there are some of these discussions, right? If you should take this on or not on, and different groups decide differently in this respect. And then it may not be your decision, right? There may be legal frameworks that define, but you may still be resisting it. With how much success is a question.
Thank you very much. Ashla, I think your second question actually connects very nicely to this one, and then we move on to Emma.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Thank you, Yus. I was just wondering, I mean, you've kind of started to talk about this, of course, but do you believe that like research within human biology can do anything to illuminate discussions of identity, but within the concepts of like race and culture? Where's the intersection between our scientific understanding of the human body and our intuitive knowledge of self?
Yeah, this really follows up nicely, and is of course a difficult question, right? Because we think that categories like race and so on are social categories, right? And we have to pay attention to rebiologize them, right? And so that's why this whole field is so fraught. So this is something we really would like to avoid, I think, because I think there's some agreement that these are social categories. But some of the medical and genetic research goes in, you know, people speak of the reinscription or rebiologization of race, which goes on with some of these new technologies. So it's a point of concern. And sometimes this happens quite overtly, and sometimes this happens inadvertently, right? That they come in by the back doors, as they say, right? And unexpected ways. And sometimes even for reasons of inclusions, right? Some groups are included in some trials or something, but then if you start collecting biological data according to these groups that actually census categories normally and self-identified, right? But then you find differences between the groups, and you will always find differences, between groups. Statistically, you always find differences. Then you reinscribe what were, social categories into biology, and then again it depends what you do with that. But sometimes this can lead to very discriminatory or very problematic consequences, right? So you see, science doesn't speak for itself. We need always to interpret it, and we need to pay very much attention how we do certain things, especially if it in such, difficult areas like human genetics, race, what's normal, what's abnormal. I was just this morning, I was in a round table. I was only listening in about exactly this question, right? How these new genetic technologies, how they are connected and their use in testing, especially also of prenatally and newborns and so on, how they lead us back, in sort of how much they are built on these ideas of ableism and and normality and then eugenic practices, right? So it's a big field of research and also of debates, of ethical and political and legal debates.
Right.
Yeah, I love the idea of like science not speaking for itself and like needing a context to exist in order to make sense. And the question I have is related to that, and I realize that it's like a question that doesn't necessarily have an answer. But earlier in this conversation, we talked about how you can't change someone's personal truth. Like if someone believes something, you can't change that they believe that. And I'm curious how, as a scientist, someone who like does have the facts and exists in a world where right now people's personal truths are causing a lot of harm to the community that surrounds them and the world that surrounds them, what are ways that if you can't change someone's personal truth, you can try to use science to bring them to a place that accepts both scientific facts and also a truth that maybe cares more greatly for the people that surround them?
Yeah, this would be good, right? And some people think that, educating the public, that they think there is a science deficit somehow, right? If they had better science education, if we explain it better and so on, then this would bring them around. But I think there is an agreement that this and more science or better science education alone, right? I mean, science education is important, but this alone will not change, right? And that the other things are going on, right? For instance, you can think about climate change, right? So why do you believe or don't believe in climate change, right? I mean, it's not a question of belief somehow, right? The scientists have the evidence, right? 99% of the scientists believe climate change is what's going to happen. That climate change is happening not only, but also that it's man-made. And so it's, and if you analyze who is for and who is against, you see that there have been some studies have been made. It's not a question of science education. It's actually a question of political orientation, right? And so you think there's something else going on. And so you have to engage these other things that are going on. Maybe you think, if I agree that there is climate change going on, we need these environmental laws, it means more regulations. I'm against regulation, so I better say I don't believe in climate change, right? But, then you have maybe to speak about regulation and what regulations are, and what regulations, can help or whatever, or you have to address the problem where it lies, right? And it may not lie in more and more evidence, because, for instance, in climate change, the evidence is there, right? So then there's something else going on, and you have to identify what else is going on. And then you have to work on that level. Yeah, so that.
Yeah, just that's a really beautiful answer. Thank you.
Right. And maybe following up on your remark about the importance of science education, Megan actually had a question about the importance of the history of science education. So maybe you can.
Yeah, definitely. So like we
yeah.
touched on this a little bit when we talked about like context is so important talking about science. And I think like generally curriculums only somewhat delve into historical science events before focusing more on current scientific discoveries. How do you think schools should decide what to include when talking about the history of science? Are there any specific years, topics, or people that jump out to you that you generally think are important to talk about?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Of course, I love for history of science to be introduced in science and science teaching, so I'm all for it. Yeah, no, but I think it's really important to present science not just as a set of facts that we have to learn by heart, right? But something that is made by people and that is a historical endeavor, as we have been talking now, right? So we ask specific question from specific perspective, from specific moment in time, and so on, and this keeps changing, right? And so I think and I think the pandemic is really actually a wonderful example, as I already mentioned, right? Because we have all lived through it, and because it really shows science in the making, and so it can be used to show how science works, right? So if you think, for instance, about I think I already mentioned it about the advice on masks, right? And so then our knowledge changed, and then our advice changed, right? But this is not that we should doubt science. This is just how science works, right? Science, you know, and yeah, so I think this is, you know, and you can show, so I think the pandemic would be a wonderful example to show this. And so to show how science works, to understand this, the working of science, and so also what we can expect from science, right? And so then I think one can have a bit of a more realistic expectations from science, and don't flip into this, you know, blind trust or rejection. It's not really a question of belief. It's more something like understanding and accepting.
Right. So we almost move over to the Q&A portion, and as Gina already mentioned, please put your questions under the Q&A box where Gianna will find them. Before we go there, one final question actually by Gianna, which I think is very interesting in this context, which is about Soraya, your own work and how you use fact and personal perspective. But Gianna, let me give the word to you, because you can phrase it better than I can. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. You used your background as a historian of science and your background in medicine to write a factual book. Were there any places that you were able to incorporate your personal view while still staying true to the entire message of the book?
Thank you. This is a good question. You know, I think that my personal view comes through in the kind of questions I pose, or, you know, every historian poses. For instance, you know, I have often been interested in parts of science that may not look glamorous, like, you know, these activities like collecting, classifying, building up the infrastructure for science, you know, that look routine and repetitive, but are really essential. And so, you know, you find this interest also in my latest book, or, you know, or in bits of science that have been neglected. We've already talked about this, like the observation of chromosomes under the microscope. So it's like doing justice to these unspectacular aspects of science, and also the people who work on that, you know. And so that's, in a way, the message is there, right? And of course, also I speak from a particular standpoint, and so I don't think in a book on the history of science I would say out loud. So, you know, and because also as a historian you always try to do justice, right, to the time, to the people, to, you know, and it's really more indirectly in the way you present it that your opinions become clear. But but also, especially also the question you choose. In a way, you say, this is an important, by writing on something or researching something, you think, this, I think, is an important question, right? And then you say why it's an important question. So I think it's a little more hidden, but all over the place.
Very nice, thank you. Yeah, and with that, we go over to the Q&A, and I hand it over to Gianna. Yeah.
Hi, yes, so we're starting the Q&A portion. We'd love to hear any and all questions that you guys have, so please put them in the Q&A box. And I'd like to start with a question from the audience that says, instead of thinking that science in some broad sense is aimed at truth, I wonder if we are better off thinking that the scientific research aims at explanation, prediction, and control, or the ability to manipulate nature. Thus, with scientific progress comes increasingly understanding, increased predictive ability, and increased ability to intervene to produce the outcomes we want in the world or our bodies, etc. This may distance the science from the questioning of truth. Is that a good account or idea for the sciences?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think generally this is a good idea because, as I said, truth is a very big word, right? And we have, what I would maybe say something about is this idea of progress, right? Because I would say there is a change, but progress in which respect, and is it respect to better and so on, and it would be nice if we become better in predicting, but that doesn't always seem to be the case. I mean, my general point is that, I think my really very, very general point in this whole conversation is that science is also part of history. It's not somehow outside history, right? And, what may seem like progress at one moment in time in history doesn't seem like progress a few years on, right? And unfortunately, we have not become very much better in predicting. Also, there are a lot of interest behind also these things. I mean, like commercial interest and so on. So, we have to put them in. So I do really think that we have to think about science as a historical process. And so I think, yes, I would underwrite what you say, but looking critically at this word of progress and maybe speak more neutrally about change.
So we have another question from one of our own members, Lexi, who was unable to make it today. And she was wondering, how can science be a tool to help guide society through the diverse political and social struggles of our time? Conversely, how can it create political and social division?
Yeah, it would be nice if science could solve, these divisions we have. But I'm not sure this is possible. What we actually see is that science itself becomes a subject of division, right? You're for it or against it, right? Which is surprising because you think somehow science is about facts. So what can we not agree about some basic things? And apparently not, right? So I think I am not. I think I don't think science can necessarily help. To address these divisions that seem to be. They seem to lie somewhere else, right?
So we have another question also by Lexi, which is really great because it's looking at our future and how we want to move forward. And she asks, how can we teach young kids to always approach information through different lenses, science specifically?
Yeah, I think just to be curious and inquisitive and asking questions. I think that would be the basis, not just learning facts and writing exams and making it, but asking questions and being critical and curious and inquisitive. I think that would be the main, I would build lessons around that.
Great, thank you. We have another question by Hughes, and it says, if science is depending on history, is it also dependent on culture? Can different cultures use different interpretations or even definitions of science?
Yeah, that's different. So yeah, culture, history, that's yes. But you know, science, as I mean, you know, as it's, there are different ways of knowing. So maybe that would be like this. But you know, this science, you can ask different questions if we're in different places and points and have different issues, right? You will ask different questions. That's also, you know, that's also this idea that we always speak from a standpoint. You know, the idea, sometimes science seems to be speaking like something beyond, you know, God's eye view or something. But no, so that this is the feminist critique to science, that we always speak from particular standpoints. They don't even speak about biases, even if biases do, of course, exist, but from standpoints, and we have to be reflexive on our standpoints. And that's then also the reason why we have to include people from different standpoints to make a more robust science. You know, they speak about strong objectivity. So it's not about introducing subjectivity, but it's making objectivity stronger, which is, you know, we haven't maybe spoken so much about subjectivity and objectivity, which plays in here, I think. So introducing different standpoints makes science stronger objectivity. Now I have lost my train of thought. Can you, have I answered the question? I think I've lost my train of thought.
Emma, go ahead. You wanted to...
Sorry, I have a follow-up question. Like thinking about bringing different viewpoints in, and Hannah, this is also related to a question that you had, I know. So if I'm stealing it, jump in. What are some ways to do that? And like, do you think that it depends a lot on like the diversity of the scientists that are doing the science? Because I think that like, it's interesting to think about if science can be a little amorphous, if we can ask different questions, should we be pushing for a more diverse set of people doing that science in order to get maybe a broader range? And on the flip side, do you worry that then that will further complicate a scientific narrative and bring us farther away from a communal understanding of a truth?
And no, that's very much the understanding now that, you know, we need a diverse science bodies, and that this will change the kinds of questions that are asked, and that this is a good thing. And it's also about involving the communities, about which research, you know, may happen. This should also happen in interactions with the communities, to ask the questions that actually the communities are interested in, and so on and so on. Now, that's definitely the way science is moving. I mean, you know, I can look at life sciences at UCLA, and I mean, that's a lot of effort going into, you know, diversifying the student bodies, diversifying the faculty, and so on, and with the understanding that things will change, and that the questions that are asked will change, and but that this is a good and necessary development to take away some blinders that we have, right? Which doesn't, you know, that's why I'm saying science is in that respect really a historical process, and we will always discover new things, right? That you know, we haven't been looking at, or we haven't been considering, or we haven't been asking, or, you know, our technologies didn't allow us also to ask. Yeah, so I do think that this is, no, I don't think it will make science more problematic. I think it will make it less problematic.
And Natalie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess we briefly touched upon the issue of climate change a few minutes ago. And I think along with the pandemic, of course, this is kind of one of the most perhaps pressing ways that civil society is interacting with issues and questions, scientific questions on a daily basis. And so I'm wondering, thinking about the Anthropocene, how has the landscape of knowledge production in the life sciences shifted, if it has, with the dawning recognition among experts and the public alike that human activity has become the dominant influence on the environment?
Yeah, this is an important question. This idea, and I think we touched on it in an earlier question, that nature changes. So the distinction between nature, for natural sciences, and culture for the humanities, that's actually, even this distinction is not so clear anymore. If nature becomes culture in a way, right? Yeah, this is certainly happening, but it's not completely new, as I said already in relation to the virus, or also with genetic technologies. Some people have argued that once we intervene, we have the capacity to intervene into the genome, right? Also, this distinction between what's nature and what's culture is sort of falling apart, right? So it's not completely new, but certainly also happening in the context of the research on the climate and the Anthropocene. And there's just currently an exciting conversation happening if actually the Anthropocene is really a new geological era. This is just being discussed. And then if so, when does it start? And supposedly it may start in the 1950s. So it's just a conversation that's going on in particular circles, and they're deciding if they're actually officially moving to live in the Anthropocene retrospectively, because supposedly this change has happened, and the question is here with the geologists is if it shows up in the sediments, right? And so, yeah, so a big challenge to how we think about things.
Thank you. And we have one last question from Jasper, who is an audience member. And he asked, how do you think science is viewed in our current time versus in other periods in history? Was science any more trusted than in other periods? Are we in a time of particular distrust of science?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And, I'm actually teaching science technology in the 20th century, teaching a course. And I just discussed this with the students. And, and so there I presented that, there is this belief in science, into this progressive force of science, a modernizing force of science. We start 1900 and then it moves on. And that there is some kind of a break. People have spoken about this, historians, of changing attitudes towards science in the late 60s, 1970s, with the, when there is a change and asking about more so social responsibility for the scientists, maybe, just not just assuming that whatever scientists do is good and progressive, but actually questioning this, right? And this being a question that we always have to ask again, for whose benefit is it? And is it, and is it the direction we want to follow? And what a safeguard do we have to put in place? I do think, and this has really very much to do also with the job I do, because, there was a time that science seemed to have so much authority in our society that it seems that it was useful to criticize this and, just ask the question, how does it come that science has such an authority in our society? But currently, this has, I think, really changed dramatically. Science has come under attack quite dramatically in this country. I can mention the Trump administration, and so then we also have to wonder about our message, right? And so, because we have to pay attention, but I still think one should not fall back to the idea to say science is this absolute truth, because I think this would be dangerous. I think it's more that we do need to understand how science works and what we have to, what we can expect on science, and when it makes sense to follow science, like, for instance, and when we trust scientists, for instance, climate scientists, if they tell us, and I all agree that this is an issue, then it's good to listen to it and decide what we can do with it, instead of believing or not believing in it just because of some other reasons, right? So I think especially because some people speak about, a crisis in the trust of science, it's important, this conversation that we have, right? So that we that we understand how science works and what it can provide and what it can't provide.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all the viewers for coming today and joining us and asking amazing questions. And I'd like to give a very special thank you to Professor Soraya for giving us very interesting insights and joining us today. Our next program will be on Wednesday, June 22nd, 4 p.m. Pacific time. Our guest speaker will be Vijay Gupta, violinist, social activist, and recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant, who will be speaking about truth and the social impact of music. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you very much for your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Soraya.
Thank you.